This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 379, entitled "Why Women Oppress Men Far Worse Than Vice Versa." Description: this video imagines a masculist initially speechifying a bunch of monoconscious feminazi bigots, and when that doesn't work, imagining he's talking to a more polite mixed audience as to why he claims that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, presenting his well-worn masculist arguments that everyone ought to know in a biconscious society. The flyer itself. Why Women Oppress Men Far Worse Than Vice Versa, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Imagine a few years from now that most men are familiar with the arguments in this flyer and how that knowledge will affect their interactions with feminists, particularly the feminazis, that is, the utterly repulsive, misandrous bitch type of feminists. Imagine a few years from now that you, as a well-informed masculist, are walking downtown and you come across a feminist demonstration with placards, megahorns, full of fat, ugly, male-dumping feminazi bitches, repulsive type women. And imagine you are intellectually armed with masculist rhetoric, with reasons why women oppress men far worse than vice versa. And imagine your impatience with a monoconscious feminazi bigotry that you hear all around you. You are motivated to tell these monoconscious feminazi bigots that they have a very gender-biased view of the world, thinking that gender oppression is a one-way street, when you, as a biconscious masculist, know that that is not the case. So you're motivated to set them straight by giving them a masculist speech, showing them that gender oppression is a two-way street, and that in reality women oppress men far worse than vice versa. So you launch into your little speech as follows. You women believe that gender politics is a female monopoly, that men are the oppressors of women, that gender oppression is a one-way street. Well, it's not. In reality, women oppress men far worse than vice versa. Unfortunately for you, the feminist group you are talking to are aged in their 20s and 30s, so have grown up from birth with feminist rhetoric, which has utterly brainwashed them all their lives, in capitals, that gender oppression is a one-way street, perpetrated by men against women. This group of feminists consists mostly of undergrads and high school teachers with IQs in the 120s and 130s, so not super bright, who are smart enough to be dangerous, but not smart enough to keep an open mind to contrary evidence, that is, they are bigots, monoconscious feminazi bigots, that is, MFBs. They hear your opening sentences, but when you assert that in reality women oppress men far worse than vice versa, they find that utterly ridiculous, since it flies in the face of all that they have ever heard in the context of gender politics, so it gives them cognitive dissonance. So they explode in rage against you, telling you, "Fuck off, you male chauvinist." Some of the very hefty females approach you with fists raised, so you abandon your speech and beat a hasty retreat, since you don't want to be disfigured for life by middle-browed feminazi Amazon peasants. So instead, imagine that you are brighter than the above bunch of feminazis and are giving a masculist talk to a mixed audience who are a lot more polite and are prepared to listen even though most of the women in the audience think the very title of your talk is ridiculous, since they too are monoconscious and know nothing about masculist ideas, although some of them have heard about masculism, namely that a lot of men are now rejecting marriage and paternity, causing large numbers of young women now to be babyless. They are alarmed at this, so are somewhat primed to listen to what a masculist has to say, but with considerable scepticism. You launch into your speech, as you did with the feminazi group, and continue on uninterrupted with the following quotes. Women oppress men far worse than vice versa, because women's oppression of men is continuous and lasts decades, in capital letters. For example, women's financial parasitism, women's manslavery, women's fluffy feminist hypocrisy in the divorce courts, women's tooth and nail opposition against the legislation of the that's paternity rejection right, in all its hypocrisy, given that women have the maternity rejection right. Women's many gender crimes against men that have decades-long repercussions. For example, women's paternity fraud. For example, in about 5% of pregnancies, the husband is not the father. So the husband is trapped into paying for a kid that is not his, and for 2 decades, that is long-term manslavery. Women's pill lying, where the woman lies to her boyfriend/husband that she is taking the pill, gets pregnant against his will, and then forces him with a paternity suit to pay for a kid he does not want, manslaving him for 2 decades. These gender crimes that women commit against men vastly outweigh the gender crimes that men commit against women. Women have already won the legal battle to attain equal rights with men. For example, equal pay for equal work, equal access to the professions, the right to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, the right to divorce at will, etc. You tell your audience that feminism had to come first because masculism, since the reverse... I'll say it again. Feminism had to come first before masculism, since if the reverse were true, that is, if women who were not careerists, who did not have career-competent educations, then if the men rejected being manslaves to women, then his family, his wife and kids, would have starved, particularly in the historical era in which there was no welfare state, no Labour political parties, no unemployment insurance, no health insurance, etc. Feminism had to occur first in order to push women into the workforce so that men could afford to work less, earn less, and spend more of their own time doing what they wanted to do rather than being manslaves to a parasitic female who wanted him to work for her so that she could stay at home raising her kids in a household that he paid for. So in historical terms, we are now at the beginning of the masculist era, in which men start liberating themselves from the traditional male role of being a manslave to a fluffy parasite, that is, a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite of the money and labour of a man. Most women, including most feminists, have a deeply ingrained attitude and expectation of men that, quote,
men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies.
It's this attitude that the masculists are killing off by refusing to marry, rejecting paternity, and going their own way, spending their money on themselves and not giving it to fluffy parasites who have not bothered to get a career-competent education that makes them FIPs, that's financially independent persons, as adults, able to pay their own way and not parasite off the money and labour of a man. You tell your audience that it was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women the contraceptive pill, household gadgets, higher education, modern medicine, life expectancies well into the 80s, so that women nowadays choose to have 0, 1 or 2 kids in most cases, so have a career window of half a century. You now get very forceful and ram home the point that now that women can work, they must work. Anything else is manslavery. You're now getting into a rhythm, so beef up the rhetoric with a lot of mental energy and conviction that is really beginning to communicate with your audience. Even the women appear to be paying attention, although with a lot of scowls on their face, since you are stating things that have gone against their lifelong indoctrination. You tell your audience that manslavery is slavery. Slavery rouses passions. Slavery is a war issue. Look at the US Civil War. That was largely about slavery. The masculists are at war against the fluffies, aiming to wipe them out by totally ignoring them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, not even pumping and dumping them, so that their fluffy parasite genes are removed from the gene pool. Thus, those women who do not fit up are punished severely by masculisted men, by being annihilated, by not getting a man. Hence they are made loveless, sexless, babyless, and as masculist ideas spread across the culture, are spat at, rejected by men and by society as being vile manslavers, as immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin. You start giving your audience more details of the masculist case. This is the end of part 1.